Okay.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome. My name's Ken Zalevsky. I am, along with Anita and Nico, we're going to present talk today on the life of an SBOM, software bill of materials. My background specifically is in medical technology. I spent 20 years running the medical device cybersecurity function at Bayer. So I have a lot of experience on the front lines, really in kind of the most highly regulated industry in healthcare. We'll talk about cybersecurity in that space a little bit today. I'll let Anita introduce herself and then we'll get started.
Hi, my name is Anita D'Amico, and I may have seen some of you last year when I was talking on the software supply chain security. At that time, I was at Synopsys Software Integrity Group, which has Black Duck, Coverity, Defensix, and I was heading up the software supply chain security product strategy. I retired, and now I'm working with small businesses like Vigilant Ops that are working in software supply chain security and working specifically in the area of SBOM management. So I welcome all of you, and we'd like to actually know more about you. So can tell me either what your interests in SBOMs are, or what vertical you're working in, what you hope to learn today. Anybody? Go ahead.
Sure. So if you are ever on like the vendor side, right, and your customer asks for an SBOM, I want to know, how do you navigate that? Because I assume that they take it, they don't know what to do with it, it's just like a check in the box type thing.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, what if you're a vendor and you're supplying an SBOM, what the heck does the customer actually do with it? And that's one of the things we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
Joe?
So once the vendor has the SBOM, one of the uses that I've seen, of course, is that they look at the third-party vulnerabilities and then require the vendor to address them and come up with a list of mitigations. Are these truly vulnerabilities? And so it's not just a matter of getting the curating the third parties themselves and producing SBOM themselves. It's also a matter of curating and triaging the security vulnerabilities that are related to them. So what I'm looking for are, what are some of the best practices that you've seen in the field for managing that relationship?
Okay, very good.
Great.
We're going to cover that too.
Yeah. It's great.
Anybody else? Yes.
So I'm interested in, because right now we've updated our HBOM to match the supply chain standards of CISA and with the SBOM standards, we're trying to, I guess, normalize that with it, so that when now we're also looking for an OT management package that we can put both our assets and our SBOMs in, so we actually have devices and SBOMs all in one system. So I'm kind of trying to figure out that step of how do we integrate the SBOM to be able to always track over to my hardware building, because that's where we have to actually then remediate certain things.
So you're looking to link your HBOM and your SBOM.
Yes.
Yes.
Much better way to put it. Sorry. Much more
That's good.
Right.
Yeah.
You mentioned CISA, and so that's the Department of Homeland Security. I forget what it stands for. Cyber Information Services Agency.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And some of the work that you're going to see here today is actually work that we synthesized from a lot of the CISA documents on producing, disseminating, sharing, and consuming SBOMs. Also, we synthesized information from NSA, from National Institute of Security, Standards and Technology, NIST. And so what you're doing is seeing some of the results of a homework assignment, basically, that we gave ourselves as to what the heck are all of these agencies saying, what are all the stakeholders saying about what to do with SBOMs, how to merge them, whether you tailor them, all these things. So that's what we're going to cover today. So let's start with the motivation. Ken?
Yeah, so there's lots of motivation out there for folks who haven't heard software bill of materials. It's quote unquote in the news. Lots of motivation to generate and consume. I think we talked already about relationships and consuming and generating SBOMs. We're getting some rules are being put into place, requirements, regulations, starting from the executive order in May of 2021. President Biden passed Executive Order 14028, which actually started to mandate software bill of materials for government contractors all the way through to medical devices. So FDA dropped their final guidance on pre-market submissions for medical devices now must include software bill of materials. So there's a lot of motivation across multiple industries, and you'll see other verticals as well that are picking up on the software bill of materials as this kind of transparent mechanism to communicate vulnerabilities across that supply chain. And before we go any further, I'll stop real quick and just give you a little primer on software bill of materials. So really what we're looking at when we talk about software bill of materials are these the elements or the software components that are running in a system. So somebody mentioned hardware BOM. Same idea. There's the hardware elements in a system, and there's the software elements in the system. And the software elements in the system are the software bill of materials. And so if you look at the minimum set of requirements, so there's standards out there. NTIA's got their minimum set of requirements for an SBOM. It includes things like the supplier name, which makes a lot of sense for that particular component. The names of the component, the versions of the component. So the idea is to be able to track vulnerabilities against these software components. And this information identifies the components in a way that you can track those vulnerabilities. And so there are multiple formats out there today that are considered standards, which is a little strange. There's SPDX and CycloneDX, and you'll hear some of these terms. This is the way SBOMs are formatted and transferred from a producer to a consumer.
Now, one of the things you'll notice that's not listed in that minimum data are the vulnerabilities, right? So you mentioned that you wanted to know, and vulnerability management is important, but it's not a part of the minimum elements. So there are things that you have to do to an SBOM and with an SBOM to get at that vulnerability analysis. Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, and real quick, I'll just say this is just I took a build SBOM in what's called SPDX format, again, one of the standard formats for the SBOM, and kind of laid out, if you really looked at this in kind of, it's human readable in a sense, but the idea is to kind of, I picked out the minimum elements. You can see the authors in there, the timestamps in there, and the important stuff is in there. As Anita mentioned, what you don't see are vulnerabilities. So we need to do something with this. We need to make this actionable. Just giving this to somebody as your consumer isn't really helpful. So you think about, well, I hand you an SBOM, great, what do I do with that, right? And so we'll get into talking about how to consume that SBOM and how to make it more actionable as we go.
So that's what SBOM Lifecycle Management is, also known as SBOM Operations. It's an emerging market. It still doesn't have a vernacular that people are using. CISA is now calling it SBOM Operations. Gartner's calling it SBOM Management. But it's really about what you do with an SBOM, the actions that you take after you generate the SBOM. And these are actions that could be done by really three major personas: the software producer, the distributor of the SBOM, which could be the producer, and the consumer of the SBOM. And these actions are taken in order to get more value from the SBOM other than check the box, I got one, right? So they could impact security, transparency. They could be license compliance. There's procurement processes. There's a number of things that people do with them. And what you're going to see in the next several slides is that it is a very dynamic, multiplayer system. And it spans the life cycle, and things change over time. And the people that are involved with it are all different types. So on the producer side, it's the software release engineers, might be the AppSec team, could be the product security team. And then when you get both at the producer and consumer, the risk and compliance people get involved. Later on, procurement gets involved. So there's a lot of people who touch this SBOM. So let's take a look at what this lifecycle management is. Now, I said that we put this together by looking at all those CISA documents, NSA, NIST, talking to people who are producing SBOMs and consuming SBOMs. And it looks kind of complicated. So we're going to break it down for you. The first thing is that you should note that there's three parts to this diagram. There's the software producer, there's the dissemination or the sharing, and then there is the software consumption. And when you look at, well, who cares about this? Who's looking at this? On the producer side, there is the medical device manufacturers that Ken is very familiar with. Financial services, we're seeing they are producing software and they want to see that SBOM. U.S. government software suppliers. The U.S. government is now requiring every single software supplier, other than open source, to issue an SBOM for the software they deliver. Any big B2B enterprise software house is doing this. And manufacturing, automotive is a perfect example. You're building an infotainment system in a car. It's a big software system, and it's comprised of many different pieces. It's got the navigation system, the radio, it's got all kinds of things in there. And so manufacturers are interested in this. And as it said, there's a lot of different stakeholders. On the consumer side, what we're seeing is that healthcare is now requiring that they get SBOMs. Financial services, pretty much the same on the right is the same as the left. What's interesting is the middle. Who actually disseminates this? That's one of the big crossover points. Like, okay, I have an SBOM. How do I deliver it to you? Producers, software producers are doing that. But what we're seeing emerging is, and probably, and maybe in about 3 years, you're going to see clearinghouses for SBOMs. So if I'm in automotive, I know where I could get all my SBOMs for automotive. If I'm in healthcare, I know where to get them. So you're probably going to see those emerge. But let's go back to the life cycle. Who care? Why do they care? Why are these industries doing this? Well, we've actually done a use case analysis in working with one of the CISA committees. And so one thing is that in software development, they want to see what are the differences between software builds or versions. You could very easily do that if you have a way of comparing SBOMs. Or to look at, if I have 100 SBOMs from different parts of my system, is there a critical component that's appearing in most of them? Risks, all kinds of risks you're using it for. Licensing risks, security risks, and policy and compliance risks. You're seeing it in consumer side on purchasing. They won't buy your software unless they not only get the SBOM, but they've actually looked at the vulnerability analysis that was done on the SBOM, as well as the licensing risks. And then they're feeding that into their vendor risk management system. And then also at the consumer side, you see them using the SBOMs to query them and say, do I have an end of life on some component that I should be concerned about? Or if there's an incident, they're looking at, okay, Log4j came in. What are all the components in all of my SBOMs to have Log4j? And then there are some special use cases in medical technology. Ken?
Yeah, so to kind of bubble that up and talk about what is actually happening and use case from a medical technology perspective, as Anita mentioned, you've got all this information, you're pulling it together, you're trying to figure out how to make it actionable. There's a big compliance movement. So one thing we can talk about is FDA pre-approval. So if you're a medical device manufacturer today trying to get a product approved for sale through FDA, you can't do it unless you have a software bill of materials. But interestingly enough, FDA has what they call a post-market analysis that needs to be included with the pre-market submission. So it gets a little confusing, but you're submitting a product for sale through a pre-market process, but you already have to be thinking about what comes next, because FDA wants to know what's your plan for vulnerabilities inevitably that are going to hit in the field against those devices. How do you monitor and how do you fix those? So they want to get this whole hospital breach activity under control in some sense by saying we have plans out there to be proactive when medical devices need updates. Here's how we're going to do that, right? And so that's a big change on the medtech side from an FDA perspective, requiring plans to monitor before the product is even launched. So that's an interesting development. And again, SBOM support that use case, providing that information for devices that are being engineered, and then devices that are in the field. So if you think about a fielded device, a medical device, it could be a scanner, or it could be an injector or a patient monitor, for example, in a hospital room. You want to look at the software components in that, but you don't want to just look at it once when it's deployed. You want to look at it again and again continuously, because there's something called drift in these devices in the field, that the versions of components kind of get updated without folks recording them. Maybe security patches are installed or not installed that should have been, and those things need to be continuously monitored. So it's an ever-evolving space, as we know. Vulnerabilities continuously hit. You have a question?
Just curious, have there been any cases yet where the FDA has issued any sort of recall kind of action against devices that are in the field and the supplier of software to them is not maintaining security?
Yeah, that's a great question. The question was, has FDA recalled any devices because of these cybersecurity breaches? Yes, as a matter of fact, a few years back, folks might have heard there was an insulin pump, a Hospira pump. Actually, it was not an insulin, but just a general pump that was used across a lot of hospitals. And FDA warned Hospira that they had a critical vulnerability in their pump, and they gave them the ample warning to get that fixed, right? And Hospira went about their business and did not respond quickly enough to FDA. They gave them a couple more warnings, and then finally, FDA issued a letter to hospitals using those pumps saying they're unsafe. And that actually was a big move by FDA, and it resulted in these pumps, of course, being pulled from a lot of hospitals, which was a bad thing for Hospira. So, yeah, it's a good example of...
Did they leverage SBOMs to keep an eye on, hey, are you actually changing anything?
SBOMs weren't informed back then. It was a very nascent, and they still are. The life cycle on the hospital side of SBOM adoption is still in its infancy. Back then, it would have been great to have an SBOM to say, I've got this vulnerability, right? So there were other methods. There's also a lot of post-market surveillance that happens, even without SBOMs, but SBOMs were a great way to get right to that, right? But that's a great question. Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how much homework is the FDA doing when they, get an SBOM that says, like, hey, there's a critical vulnerability in this software package? Because, when you're triaging these things, it might not be exploitable in the wild. It may not be that's not easy to exploit. There's all kind of like these layers of triaging you have to do. So, is the FDA warning these vendors and recalling things based on just the fact that it appears, or are they doing additional layers of research?
Actually, they're just getting into that now with their so FDA starting to collect SBOMs now is a new thing, right? So they just dropped this guidance at the end of 2023. So we're kind of getting into this now. They're getting the SBOMs in to do an analysis on the SBOMs. I think a lot of it's going to come down to this monitoring good security practices from the vendor is one big thing that FDA looks at beyond the SBOM, right? So if you're a vendor, you want to increase your security profile by saying, I'm continuously monitoring, you're having that plan to monitor, those kind of things. So FDA works quite a bit with vendors at this point to get them kind of on the right track. I think that's going to slowly fade, right? I mean, this is kind of training wheels period, right? With the SBOM, right? So we're going to kind of go through this phase where you'll see a lot of hand holding and let's get right down this path, and then I think eventually it'll get to the point where like, okay, you got to have it right, So that's a good question. Yeah.
Question? Yeah.
How do you ensure the integrity of the SBOM and the software?
We'll get to that.
Yeah. Good question. How do you ensure the integrity of the SBOM?
That's part of the lifecycle management. So this is the lifecycle, and we're going to start at the top of that diagram, right? Take it apart. There's essential SBOM management operations. And this is, very simple. You generate SBOMs or you import them, you verify them, and we're going to get to the verification and certification. You stick them someplace safe, and somebody grabs them and consumes them. So what happens along the way? Well, the first thing is that you need to generate the SBOMs, and there's different types of SBOMs. And in a few minutes, Ken's going to show you the differences between some of the results of a build SBOM versus a deployed SBOM. A deployed SBOM is an SBOM that you generate on a device that's in the field that should match what was built, but won't necessarily. So, and it's also going to have other things on it that have been deployed with the device. When you generate the SBOM, you're going to verify it for NTIA elements. It has to have the minimum elements. It's got to be in one of those three acceptable formats, SPDX, CDX, or SWID. And here's where we get to the answer to your question. In regulated industries, there is a review and approval process. So why don't we actually talk about that now? Explain
Sure.
what they review, and actually we have it later
We might
on.
have a-
We may have it later on.
Last one, but is NTIA specific to healthcare? or
No.
is that that's okay.
No, that's the National Telecommunications and Information
We're-
Administration.
We're going to get to the review and approval, okay, and you're going to see it. But first, let's talk about one of the things, important things that's in an SBOM are dependencies, okay? Here are the components, and this software depends on these components. But how many steps down do you go? What if it has components A, B, C? Well, A is dependent on A1, A2, A3. How far down that path do you go? That's called transitive dependencies. So Ken's going to take that from here.
Yeah, so to kind of get a little, we'll geek out a little bit on transitive dependencies for a second and just talk about, if you think about software, the complexity of software and complexity of software components is, in a lot of situations, you have software components that rely on other software components that in turn can rely on other software components. So I can nest that n levels, and we call that transitive dependency. So if y'all remember from the old days of arithmetic, you think about transitive dependency, you have A depending on B, depending on which B depends on C. Now you have A dependent on C. If you don't know that you have that transitive dependency in your software, you won't know that a vulnerability in C is actually impactful to A, right? So the idea is through the software bill of materials, what we're trying to do is add this layer of information that shows you this complex chain of interdependent components to show you where vulnerabilities that you may not think would be impactful actually are. And when they call that reachability analysis, there's another way to say it. But the idea is, again, you can see this tree structure that we have here. We start with a project on the one side. This happened to be an open source project that we looked at and identified the dependencies. And you go from left to right and basically look at the dependencies with the number of nodes coming out of those, and you can see we kind of keep chaining down the line to components that are nested below there. The other interesting thing is, Anita mentioned the auto industry. If you think about infotainment systems in cars, I'll take it up a level from the SBOM, but an infotainment system in a car has got multiple systems connected to that, right? So now think about a product like an infotainment system that has another product nested in it, which may have another product nested in that. And so now you implement that structure with an SBOM, and now you've got SBOMs within SBOMs. So we got this complexity, right? And the idea is, how do you manage all this? And we'll get into we'll show you how we do that.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the build and deploy.
Right. So the other piece that we like to talk about is we mentioned the build SBOM, and we mentioned a deployed SBOM, and we'll just real quickly define what they are. So the build SBOM is generated while you're building your software. Okay, so the engineers are in the CI/CD pipeline building software, generating SBOMs. We call that the build SBOM. When you deploy that system or software to the field, you also have, as Anita mentioned, a need to track the components in that system. We call that the deployed SBOM. Now the interesting thing is, what we've done is we've taken the build SBOM from the engineering environment and the deployed SBOM, and we've combined them together to make what's called a comprehensive SBOM. And if you know how software gets deployed, you know that when you deploy a piece of software on a system, it changes a little bit. So you get runtime dependencies and other things that get loaded at runtime that don't get loaded in the build side. So if you don't do this combination of these two SBOMs, you're going to miss vulnerabilities. So we create what's called a comprehensive SBOM to capture all the vulnerabilities across both deployed and build.
This is very useful because when a field service, let's say that you have infusion pumps or heart monitors or something in a hospital, and the field rep from the medical device manufacturer goes there, and let's say there's some problem where they want to check it, they're going to go equipped with the SBOM as it was built. And now they're going to go into that place and they're going to remotely generate an SBOM from a deployed device and compare the two. And that's what Ken referred to as the drift.
So when you say mostly deployed, are you talking about SBOM asset management? Because let's say I have a production environment and I have all the assets and each one of the assets has their own component. Is there a mandatory aspect of monitoring all the inventory over time? You know exactly what is the current, because it's dynamic, what's the current asset management or the SBOM asset management?
There's not a current mandate for that. No, so that's kind of the consumption side of the SBOM, and you're looking at, it's a good point, asset. So the question was, asset management, is there a requirement around SBOMs being part of an asset management system, I think, and there's not a requirement today for SBOMs to be part of that, but that's a great integration point for SBOMs, because if you think about that, you've got information about that asset that gives you the location, the vendor, all kinds of information about that asset, and now if you plug in the components from an SBOM, you get a more complete picture. And so it's a great point, and consumers should be doing that. When we talk about consumers, we'll get into a little bit of that. That's a great question. Yeah.
Another question?
There are requirements, how many levels down for transit capture.
There are no requirements for how many levels down. In fact, some vendors will only give you one level. So,
Yeah.
if you just check in the box, they're going to give you one level. If you are a consumer or you're doing vulnerability analysis, you want to ask them to give you more levels. So here's an example, actually a worked example of what I just described at the field rep.
Yeah, so if you think about it, so we'll just dig into it a little quickly. We talked about it already, but if you've got we'll talk med tech here for a second, but if you think about a hospital, and as I mentioned, you've got, I think the number is more than 15 connected medical devices per hospital room today on average. So lots and lots of connected devices out there with lots and lots of drift or lots of vulnerabilities, potential vulnerabilities. And if you look at what, as Anita pointed out, what was engineered and should be, quote unquote, should be on that system and what is actually on that system, and compare those SBOMs, you'll quite often see a difference. And so we use a deployed device SBOM for that comparison so that we can actually fix those things in the field. So if you're a field service representative going out to fix a $2 million scanner, you want to know what's running on that scanner. You get an SBOM, you compare it to what should be on there, you make the appropriate patches. Today, that's not actually happening. That's what we foresee as should happen. It's a great way to support field devices, but the legacy issue in healthcare is because a lot of this is an unknown. It takes on average 277 days for a hospital to respond to vulnerability, and that's because they don't know. So we're trying to make this more transparent, and that's a great use case in the field called deployed device SBOM to really support that field space.
It would also be very useful for things like FEMA or any kind of emergency response where you have devices out there and they kind of like things get put on those devices along the way, and now you have some issues and you need to figure out what's on there. So we're just working our way through the very top list, and just a few things here. One is that, of course, the storage should be secure. And one of the things that ideally you want to see in the storage is an SBOM history, so you can see how it changed over time. Also, when it comes to delivering the SBOM to the consumer or the consumer asking for it, a lot of this is just done by emailing your SBOM, right? But that's not web scale, and it's not secure. So what you're seeing now in these secure repos is either an automated direct push to the consumer or a direct pull. And when the consumer gets it, then that consumer needs to be able to do something. We'll get to that in a minute. So we're going to move into the next level. What you saw was the basic stuff, right? Now let's talk about the advanced stuff. And most of your questions are more about the advanced area. So then why don't you take the first point?
Yeah,
So
so
cover the
Yeah. So Anita mentioned before, you've got, especially in regulated environments, you need to have audit trails for activity that's happening to products and systems that you're building and selling. We have on the left side of this, we have kind of this process where you're generating the SBOMs, you're looking at the risks, you're identifying and fixing vulnerabilities. All of that information, all the notes that you're making, all the mitigation that you're doing, all the threat analysis, it needs to be recorded in an audit trail. So we collect an audit trail that goes through kind of a review and approve process. And so you've got multiple eyes looking at the SBOM and all the nodes and getting through that through that workflow, if you will, of the SBOM. And at the end of it, you get an SBOM that's what we call verified or certified. So you don't have just a kind of an SBOM that an engineer's cooked up and thrown out there. You've got an SBOM that's actually gone through this rigorous process of being verified and validated before it's actually released.
So that was the answer to your question. But unfortunately, it's only done in some very regulated industries, right? And so it's one of those things that you have to trust the vendor that they're going to do it unless you have this kind of cycle.
So, question, what on the consumer side, what do you guys recommend on the cadence of updating it? Because on the producer, it's a little bit more control. You can, generate a new product every day, but on the consumer, if you keep on purchasing new pieces of software, how often should you worry about updating the rest?
So one of the things that you can do as a consumer, if you have a sophisticated SBOM management or operations system, is that you can be set up to receive notifications of when a new version of that software comes in. And so it can alert you as to when the new version comes in, and then you can decide whether or not to request it. Or if you have that automated pull and push, you can set up rules, right, with the producer as to, okay, when you have a new version, push me to SBOM. So there's those types of things. This is advanced SBOM operations. Most of the industry is drawing, walking. In medtech, it's really moving quickly. And we're starting to see that move more quickly also in the government because people have to require SBOM in order to do something. To your point, John, you were asking about vulnerability. Now, can you talk about dispositioning?
Yeah, so we've taken SBOM and we got the information about the components, we talked about the dependencies, and you're able to kind of scan through that information. As an engineer, you can start to look at dispositioning those vulnerabilities in the SBOM itself. So again, this vulnerability information is not a requirement. You can see it, that's not on the minimum element list, but including that is very, very helpful. I mean, it's actually makes it actionable. So if I'm able to go in as an engineer and look at the vulnerabilities, rank them in terms of criticality, maybe in terms of exploitability, there are various factors that you use to rank those vulnerabilities, and then fix the ones or mitigate the ones that I need to most quickly. I can track all that and get it into the SBOM and then get that information out to the consumer. And again, you're eliminating this, the noise that happens when consumers see a vulnerability and start to worry about is my product impacted. Getting out ahead of that curve as a producer is really, really
And those dispositions can be put into your VEX formatted the vulnerability disclosure.
So here's where we run into some challenges where threat dependencies is a little more complicated. Most of the time, mitigation, sometimes the CD doesn't have mitigation really discern if you can mitigate without the version. Where we run into particular problems with that approach is when you have transit devices. So take for instance Romy, which has hundreds of transit devices. That is released randomly quickly. It's unreasonable to expect development teams to drill into Romy source code to determine if Google itself has a vulnerability in the Romy. That should be the responsibility of Google, I would think, to get that kind of yes. But we're not seeing it. And so we're in a position where we're bringing open source that's not deep. Many testing techniques. And curating vulnerabilities there is sometimes you need to rely on Google to be able to mitigate. And I don't know if there's a great answer for that, but that's a real problem.
No, that's great. The point that was made was that what I'll call it like proprietary software is if you don't have the SBOM for it, how do you really get in, really triaging that in the appropriate way, right? If you don't know what's in that, you're guessing at best. And what we see is, and that's exactly the state of the industry today. And I think when we look at SBOMs and the future of SBOMs, where this is all heading, at the end of the day, in my mind, what I see is kind of a transparent supply chain where you have vendors like Google and Microsoft and others providing SBOMs for components that we put into products, right? So now, as a consumer of that product, you should get the product, you should get the SBOM, you should understand what the vulnerabilities are, so you can triage, you can say, well, that's Google's, that's mine, right? I mean, you can't do that today. And I think as we go forward, we're going to see a little bit more of that. We're working with Microsoft right now as a partner. They're actually trying to get SBOMs out there for a lot of their products. And they put out, I think, at least a couple of open source tools that you can generate SBOMs against Microsoft products today. So the idea is we talk about this here in the middle with the merge, multiple SBOMs. What we're trying to do in the platform here is to take an SBOM from a Google, for example, and merge it into an SBOM that you created for a proprietary product, so that now you're monitoring exactly what you need to monitor, the right components at the right level, because you have that vendor information. And that's just not state of industry today. That's where we're headed. I hope.
Is there any software solutions that there's open source stuff for managing
But the question is, are there any software solutions for automating the SBOM management?
Yeah, or provide, like if you buy, tool, and maybe that's one for it. It's just, so verify.
That's what Vigilant Ops does.
Yeah. That's good. No, that's exactly what we do. So, Vigilant Ops created, so I launched the company in 2019 to do exactly that, SBOM management. Right? So we'll help organizations get SBOMs. So you can import SBOMs from manufacturers. You can actually generate your own SBOMs within the tool, but you can pull these into a management structure that allows you to do exactly that. So then you get automated alerts, you get all kinds of things that go along with that SBOM management. You can have a review and approve and all that good stuff. So yeah, that's exactly it.
It's an emerging market. There are very few vendors. There are some. Vigilant Ops is one that is, and particularly with regulated industries. So one of the things that Vigilant Ops does, and this is important for manufacturing, is this merging of multiple SBOMs. So there's a couple different ways you can do it. You can do a flat merge, which is just this SBOM is associated with this SBOM. They're all part of the same thing. But another way is to merge them in a hierarchical structure. So you have an SBOM of SBOM. And if you think about an OR monitoring system, the OR monitoring system, has in it a heart rate and oxygen, and blood pressure, right? So those three, each one of those has other SBOMs. That kind of whole picture, that infotainment system is like this world. So now it's what we call SysBOM, or a system of SBOMs, or SBOM of SBOMs. And so, so that's one of the things that Vigilant Ops does is merging. Now, along with merging, which is great for the producer, but you don't necessarily want to show everything when you ship it out. So one of the things that is becoming apparent is that there's a requirement for tailoring the SBOM so that you can decide, maybe I don't, when I ship it out, I don't want to show 10 levels of transit dependencies, right? I want to show one. Or there's maybe some proprietary information about who your suppliers, subcontractors are. And so you don't necessarily want to show all the fields for everything. You have this enriched SBOM. Kind of skip this part, but there's this enriched SBOM, has all of this information in it, right? All of the vulnerabilities, and it's got the disposition of them, and here's the ones you care about, and here's the ones you don't. Maybe you only want to send the ones you care about, right? So that's called tailoring. And so that's another advanced function. All of these things, by the way, are looked at by a sophisticated procurement purchasing acquisition department. So you may, what we're seeing now is this use case where a purchasing government, for example, an acquisition authority, I need to see your SBOM. Well, what are they doing? Right? Getting back to the original question. Well, they can speak English law, right? Or they can actually look at the vulnerabilities, and there's a number of risks. There's vulnerability risks, security risks. There's license information, which, by the way, isn't one of the minimum standard fields, but it's appended to the lot of SBOMs. So they see what kind, maybe they don't want copyright risks, right? There's also compliance. So some organizations that we're starting to see in FDA are asking for end-of-life information on a component. Right? We're trying to get end-of-life but you're saying it's the end-of-life. It's not a minimum element in NTIA, but procurement officers want to see that because they want to know, in addition to taking on security risks, are they taking on maintainability risks? Okay, you can see that with the EOL. When the consumer gets this information, a sophisticated consumer will actually have some ability to put all of the SBOMs in one place and sort them. Sort them by supplier. Sort them by, look for all of the SBOMs that have this particular component that had a recent vulnerability. You can, so they can do that. They can filter on them. They can query them. And one of the things we're starting to see is that consumers are taking the SBOMs and doing a simple scoring, like Vigilant does. It's a simple scoring where they take the CBSS and they come up with an average and they give each SBOM a score. And then, if the same supplier is sending a lot of SBOMs over there, they start giving the vendor a score based on the risk level of the individual SBOMs. So now that's starting to feed into their vendor management system and their GRC system. Why don't you take this?
Sure.
Sorry.
Good.
Seeing consumers taking scoring and actually using it to change either their vendors' behaviors, fixing their software, or to say, hey, you know what, how do you use better estimates?
It's getting there. We're seeing that government first, because government's mandated SBOMs for a little longer than just general industry. But the government is trying to collect those SBOMs, and they're managing risk of vendors. A lot of it is coming from SBOMs. So they'll look at a vendor and they'll say, check the boxes, good risk or not. And I've actually, personally, I've seen some consumers of products ask for SBOMs, and if they don't get the SBOM, they ask for discounts on support of that product, because now they've got to maintain that in a more secure fashion than if they had this ability to have an SBOM, right? So there's all kinds of angles that people are playing to get an SBOM from these producers, and a lot of it comes down to the wallet.
Really, there's one who's typically talking about the continuous vulnerability.